Hello, everyone. I thought I would do a review of the book Bartleby, the Scrivener. At least that's how I think you pronounce it, which is a long short story. One might even consider it to be a novelette written by Herman Melville, who of course also wrote Moby Dick. And it's a very interesting story. I read it a few months ago, but I never got around to reviewing it, so I thought I would do it now. And essentially, the story is about a lawyer who works in an office who employs a clerk named Bartleby who works hard at first, but then eventually he stops working, and he doesn't give any reason as to why. He just says, "I don't. I would prefer not to." I mean, that's the main quote of the story is, "I would prefer not to." Perhaps even that. I don't know. Perhaps even how we say that now quite often. I would prefer not to. Well, perhaps it originated from this story, and uh, and so the lawyer keeps asking him to work, but he keeps saying, "I would prefer not to." But the lawyer doesn't fire him. The lawyer is very timid in that regard. I mean, almost any reasonable employer would have fired him already, but he is very kind and charitable to Bartleby. He tries to get him to work. He tries to reason with him, but all he ever says is, "I would prefer not to." But the employer doesn't really have it in him. He doesn't have it in his heart to fire Bartleby. So eventually he decides, and Bartleby won't leave or go home either. He just stays at the office and does nothing. And so eventually he decides to just move and switch to another office and leave Bartleby behind. But then, of course, there are going to be some spoilers here, if you haven't read it. Um, so, but then Bartleby, the people who move in say they can't get Bartleby to leave, and so eventually he has to be removed, by the police, and they end up putting Bartleby in what is essentially a homeless shelter, and or and so well, actually, it's not a homeless shelter. I think it's he goes to prison until they can decide what to do with him. And but Bartleby will not eat. He will not do anything. They try to get him to eat. He won't even eat. And so eventually, and this lawyer is still trying to look after him and take care of him, even though Bartleby is really no longer his responsibility. But eventually, he finds Bartleby dead, mainly because he's starved to death. And so you're thinking, well, why would Bartleby deliberately starve to death? And now and so then you're left with how do you interpret this story? Now some people now of course Melville's poetic powers were on display here. Prose wise, the writing is top notch. I honestly believe that Herman Melville, in terms of his writing style, is unequaled in that regard. He surpasses most writers of the 19th century and the 20th century, and and um, and even I don't really want to compare Melville to Shakespeare because Shakespeare primarily wrote dialogue, but in terms of prose, I think that Melville is unsurpassed. I would say that he even surpasses Nathaniel Hawthorne and Poe in that regard. Um, but anyway, um, but there are multiple ways to interpret this story. And so how do I interpret it? Well, some people interpret it as Bartleby being disillusioned with capitalism and somehow it's a critique of capitalism, which I'm sure that was probably an element, the idea of isolation, of someone who says, I prefer not to, being punished economically, that you must basically work to eat. But I actually don't think that that is the full, and that it is basically a form of coercion to say you must either work or starve, which I would agree with that actually. But actually, I actually don't think that's the main point of the story because Bartleby doesn't just refuse to work. Even when people offer him money or offer him food later on, he still won't take it. So the primary motivation can't be he doesn't want to work because he doesn't offer food even when it's handed to him when he doesn't have to work. So it's not that Bartleby is lazy or really even making some kind of protest against capitalism. To me, it just seems like he was deeply depressed and essentially had lost the will to live. but Bartleby lived in a society, and we still do to some degree today, that didn't recognize his problem, that would not get him help because society often does not recognize human frailty, because human frailty is a weakness that one cannot capitalize on. So to me, that's what the society. I mean, that's what the story is really about. It's not having empathy for or sympathy towards fragile people, people who are deserving of compassion, and even the employer who tries to help him. And he does, and he is a good man in that sense. Even the employer who tries to help him he is so blinded by the industry that he works in, by the system that he works in, that even he doesn't know how to do it. And so to me, the story is primarily about depression and all of the negative side effects of depression, and how depression um, is not really treated well within a purely capitalist system. It is not understood within a capitalist system because you cannot capitalize off of human frailty in that way. So to me, that's what the story is about. So yes, I think it is in some ways a critique of capitalism, but I think that it's far more complex than that. So yes, a great story by Herman Melville, Bartleby the Scrivener. You should definitely check it out.